him. And so I think that'll be a good study for us as well. But tonight I want us to talk about love and legalism. You may have heard of these two terms. They're pretty popular today when describing how one should act in response to Christianity or in response to the gospel, or how we should act in response to those in sin or towards the Bible itself. And so I think this is a pretty relevant topic for all of us because I think that we're confronted with this day by day. And so the first thing I would like for us to talk about is, are they two distinct paths? Are these talked about most of the time as being two opposite things? No, yes, sometimes. Most of the time they're kind of depicted as being on two sides of the battlefield, right? I mean, you've got to pick a side, one or the other. Which way are you going to live your life? You're going to live in a loving way, or are you going to live in a legalistic way? Like, which side of the fence are you going to choose? And so I think that's the first problem there is, because many people in the church, especially young people, see two distinct paths. And they see one as new age and more emotional and fulfilling and more in tune with what Jesus wants for his disciples to be. While at the same time, a lot of young people look on the other side of the aisle or the equation and say, well, if you're not like us and if you're not characterized by these qualities, well, then you're old-fashioned, you're pharisaical, you're legalistic, you're too binding, you're too closed-minded. And so we have this idea that it's got to be one or the other, or that these two paths are pitted against each other. And so one of the things I think about when we face this dichotomy is the woman at the well in John chapter 4. And you know that story so well. But in John chapter 4, Jesus is going to Samaria, and he's in Samaria, and he meets a woman at the well. And she's there, she's a Samaritan, and Jesus asks her for something to drink, and she says, you don't have anything to drink. And he's like, I've got living water. But anyways, she says, I perceive you're a prophet. Does anybody remember why she thought Jesus was a prophet? Knew everything about her. Specifically what? Right. She had how many husbands? Not at one time, right? But she had 5 husbands, and she was living with somebody that wasn't her husband. So she hadn't even married Mr. 6. She was just living in sin, right? She was just... Anyways, sorry, I got a slight pause in my brain. Okay, sorry. It gets better with age? Yeah. Peyton messes with me all the time, because I'll talk to Peyton and I'll be talking, I'll just stop. And he goes, forget it again? I was like, yeah. And he says, no, because we were talking about the other day about how kids are soft these days, and about like concussions and stuff. And I was like, I never had any side effects from concussions. And that was like the first 2 months I was here. And so now all the time, Peyton's like, no side effects, huh? So it happens all the time. So, but although Miss Murtis' shirt was from 2003, not 2004, and I want to tell him that during the Devo tonight, or just be like, I remember that. Okay, so what were we talking about just then? The woman at the well, that's right. And so Jesus, right, he meets this woman at the well, and she asks him a question after she realizes that he's a prophet. And she says, well, I perceive you're a prophet. Which mountain should we worship on? Because Samaritans thought that they should worship on Mount Gerizim, which is where they had erected a temple. The Jews said you had to worship on Mount Moriah, which was in Jerusalem, which is where the temple was built. And so she asked Jesus, if you're a prophet, obviously the Spirit of God is with you because you know everything about me. Why don't you answer this 400-year-old question between our two peoples? Which is the proper way to worship? And so Jesus says, you worship what you do not know because salvation is from the Jews. And so basically Jesus meets this Samaritan woman and he says, you don't have a clue what you're doing. What you're doing is not right because salvation is from the Jews. You ought to be worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem. And so Jesus doesn't take this opportunity to tell this woman at the well, it doesn't matter how you worship. God isn't concerned about where you worship or how you worship. He's just concerned about your heart or your motives behind that. Jesus doesn't tell her that in John chapter 4. And Jesus here then says that God is seeking worshipers that are going to worship him in 2 ways. What are those 2 ways? Spirit and truth, John 4:24. And so I think Spirit and truth, this idea also talks about the difference between love and legalism. Because at the end of the day, you got to ask yourself, what is truth? Spirit and truth. It's truth and emotion. And of course here, I've got on the board that it's not an emotion. But it's, where do we find truth? God's Word. That's a big deal because many times when you ask somebody who's on the love-only side of the argument, that God is only concerned about our love or our attitude or our heart or truly worshiping Him, they negate anything about rules, requirements, qualifications, things that God wants us to do. To them, it's too legalistic. It's too binding. It's too cumbersome. But Jesus tells us that truth is not an emotion. It doesn't matter how true your heart is during the act. What matters is if it's derived on God's Word. And so, can I have a volunteer that will read John 17:17? And can I also have another volunteer that will read John 8:31 through 32?
Sanctify them in thy truth, thy word is truth.
All right. Leroy says, sanctify them in truth, your word is truth. So the Bible tells us there that God's Word is truth. And then in John chapter 8, verses 31-32, we're told something pretty similar. What is that?
Then Jesus said to those Jews which believed him, "You abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."
So where does truth come from? God's Word. And so if we want to worship God truly, right, is He concerned with our emotions? Absolutely. Is that the only thing He's concerned with? Absolutely not. And so were these Samaritans good-hearted people? Probably. Does that mean that what they were doing was right? Jesus says no. And so it's more than just a love issue. It's more than just having this sort of emotion in your heart. And so spiritual living is living enthusiastically based upon God's Word. We're not negating the fact that someone has to be enthused. Yes?
I think the Scripture pretty much bears that. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments.
And which passage is that?
It's in Matthew, but I can't tell you where's that.
John 14:15. John 14:15.
That's where our neighbors are missing the point.
That's right.
They love Jesus. That's what, it's stop right there.
Well, the real question is, what determines love? Who determines what love is? And Jesus gives us the definition of love in John 14:15. And so the idea that we can have love and yet make our own path is unloving. Because Jesus tells us that true love is motivated by an act towards obedience to Him. And so does our emotions count? Absolutely. Is it the only thing that counts? Absolutely not. So spiritual living, and we're going to talk about this more Sunday in our adult class because we're going to be at Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 through 23, which talks about the fruits of the Spirit. Jesus said in Luke 6, 34 through 35, if I'm not mistaken, about how people will know us by our fruits, right, by our actions. And so, of course, how we do things matters, but also the emotion behind those things. If we walk into the assembly on Sunday morning and we sing, but it's not with emotion, if we sit there during the time to commune with the body of Christ to proclaim the Lord's death till He comes, and yet we're sitting there and we're not thinking about the sacrifice that was made, we're not reflecting on our own obedience throughout the week, if we're sitting there during the sermon or through class and just kind of just putting in pew time, is God going to be pleased with those actions? No, because the emotion is void, right? And so there has to be a balance between the truth and the Spirit. That's exactly what Jesus says in John 4:24. And unfortunately, people have pitted this question, is it love or legalism, trying to make the idea that you can't have both together, that they have to be exclusive. And I would suggest to you that they're not mutually exclusive. Hebrews 12:2 says that Jesus is the author or the perfecter of our faith. And so if Jesus tells us that both are attainable and if both are necessary to be pleasing to Him, then we've got to figure out a way how we can have both. Not one way to stand on one side and say you've got to do it exactly like this, this, and this. God doesn't care about the emotion behind the act as long as you get the act right. It's all about the function. And then those who are on the other side of the aisle say, no, it's all about form. God isn't concerned about these small things, about rules or obligations. The Bible's not a rule book. He's only concerned about the form. Well, I think God isn't concerned about the function or the form. I think He's concerned about both together. At least that's what John 4:24 tells us. Any questions or comments so far about what we've talked about? Your ideas or concerns or comments on these ideas?
Well, I certainly think about parenting as a similar, way to compare. Because when you love your children and you give them boundaries and rules with God, because that's best for them. So that's how
Right. If you couldn't hear Miss Laura Bingham, she was talking about parenting is much the same way. We want our kids to do things. We want them to have a checklist, per se, to do things in our life. But we also try to teach them how to have the right motivation behind doing those things. Because we're trying to teach them more than just do X, Y, and Z. We're trying to teach them you do X, Y, and Z because of the purpose behind those motives, those actions. And so God, much the same way, does the same with us. Great comment. Any other comments or questions? Don't be shy. Don't miss your chance to shout. As a preacher one time I went to listen to, and if it got too quiet, he'd always stop and say, "Don't miss your chance to shout." And he was trying to get people to say amen and stuff like that. I thought about breaking that out on a Sunday morning, but maybe not. So I think it's a false dichotomy. I think people have pushed this idea for so long, especially in the church, that you got to have one or the other. That if you're concerned about doing things the proper way, then your heart's in the wrong place. You don't love God, and you think the Bible's a rule book, and you don't care about how other people feel, and you're just you're a bad person because you don't love other people, and you're not accepting. But on the other side of the aisle, there's been people who have been too far and say, well, it doesn't really matter how we do it as long as we do it. It doesn't matter what I do Monday through Saturday, as long as I show up to church on Sunday at a congregation that takes the Lord's Supper every Sunday and sings a cappella, and the preacher says you got to be baptized to be saved. I can do what I want. And I've met a lot of Christians like that in my lifetime. I don't know if you have or not, but it's a false dichotomy because the Bible doesn't call us to live either type of way. It doesn't call us to be ritualistic. There's a large body of believers who call themselves Christians where their entire religious system is based on repetition. They teach you how to say the same prayer every single time. When a loved one dies, they'll ask you to recite, 95 Hail Marys. It's just based on just emotionless, non-thought-provoking repetition. Just over and over and over again. You're just meeting the sacraments just so you have the right things, the right checklist in order that you can be saved. And so that's not what God calls us to do. But we also have a large portion of Christianity that says it doesn't matter what you do. God knows your heart. As long as your heart is in the right place, nothing else matters. But I think this is a false dichotomy because the Bible teaches that those two ways aren't true. Because I think what God is asking for is where love and legalism are intertwined in obedience. Someone please read John 14:15, and then you can just skip down and read verses 23 through 24.
If you love me, you will keep my commandments. John 14:15.
Yes, sir. Can you read 23 and 24 also?
Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the words which you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me.
Obedience is what, as Christians, we're striving to do. And obedience is more than just obeying God. And obedience is more than just loving God. Obedience is doing what God says because we love Him. Did y'all notice the difference in those two things? We'll say it again. Obedience is more than just doing what God says. And obedience is more than just loving God. Obedience is doing what God says because you love Him. And that's what John 14:15 and 23 through 24 is trying to tell us. He's trying to show us the connection that we have between obedience, is the intermingling of this idea of love and legalism. Should we be loving as Christians? Absolutely. We should be some of the most loving people on the face of the earth, right? Because the Bible tells us that who is love? God, right? And if we are in a relationship with God, we should know what love looks like more than anybody else. So should we be loving? Absolutely. As Christians, should we be concerned about the Word of God and doing what it says? Absolutely. And the problem is when people rise up and say you have to sacrifice one for the other. Well, if you really want to love God, then you've got to say it doesn't matter how you worship. If you really want to love God, you can't hold on to this idea that God is concerned about how you worship or what you do in worship or what you think about salvation, because that's just not what love is. That is to sacrifice one aspect of obedience for the other. It's just the same thing. Tolerance. Anybody know the term tolerance? It was really big like 10 years ago. Now the big word is solidarity. Like if I hear solidarity one more time, and throw something on my TV screen. It's just, I don't think people even know what it means. They just recite it all the time. Like, we stand in solidarity. Anyways, 10 years ago it was tolerance, right? We got to be tolerant, got to be tolerant. And a lot of times people have replaced the word love with tolerance, right? And so I was talking to someone one time, and he was talking about how Christians are unloving. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, Christians talk all the time about how God is love and they're supposed to be loving, and you're some of the most intolerant people I've ever met. It's like, whoa, okay. Pray thee, do tell. And so he was like, you don't accept homosexuality. Like you say that this individual can't love who they want to love, and that's not loving. I was like, no, that is loving. He was like, no, you can't deny somebody's right to love who they want to love and call that loving. I was like, no, you can. And he was like, why? I was like, because you've confused two terms, tolerance and love. What you want is tolerance, not love. Because if I'm driving down the road and I see a building that's on fire, right? If I love that individual, if I go and knock on the door and I say, your house is on fire, and they say, no, everything is fine. If I love that individual, I don't care about their warped sense of reality. I care about trying to save them. And so I'm going to let them know, no, your house is on fire. Whether you like it or not, that's the case. And so if you love somebody who's in a homosexual relationship, if you love their soul, and you know the Bible says, 1 Corinthians 6:9, that those who practice homosexuality will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, what are you going to do? Are you going to be loving and let them know the status of their soul? Or are you going to be tolerant and let them live their life the way they choose? Now, of course, I'm not advocating a license to be mean, but think about that. But a lot of times people don't want love, they want tolerance, right? They don't want that. Have you experienced that in your own life? Is that a struggle that you sometimes think the world has today? Yeah. Does it make it harder for us to stand up for the truth? Absolutely, right? Because if you do, what are you going to be called? A bigot, a homophobe, a xenophobe, arachnophobe. I don't know. I think that's spiders, right? Maybe that's different. You can still be an arachnophobe and go to heaven, okay?
I think we'll probably only be more Democrats in the White House from what you just said would be labeled hate speech, and you could be arrested and charged for it.
Yeah, we don't want to get too political, but California, if you've watched in the news, are trying to ban hate speech. And one of the things in hate speech is anti-homosexual rhetoric. Well, some people have supposed that, and even one lawmaker in California who's Democrat is pro-banning the sales of the Bible in California because he sees that it's filled with hate speech, anti-homosexual rhetoric. That's in the United States of America. That's in Canada. It is already illegal to preach from a public platform, aka the pulpit, against same-sex attraction. Illegal for a preacher.
Freedom of speech.
Well, Canada doesn't have that, but ours is slowly eroding in this country as well. But I'm just saying that, literally, it is legally, you can be jailed in Canada for preaching against homosexuality. Brother Steve is saying, if this bill passes in California, it may not be too far down the road in a state in the United States as well. I'm not sure about Canada. I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know for a fact if that's the way it is or not. And so...
California's not part of the United States.
California's not part? Baja California's not. And so, I know they were trying to succeed not too long ago. I saw where Memphis is too. So, as far as I'm concerned, they can leave. I lived in West Tennessee for a while. I'm not impressed. Anyways, do what? Maybe. I don't know. It's a good question. But it's the same way. And it's like that with homosexuality. We get that, right? But in the church, it's been happening for 30 years when it comes to following the ordinances of the Bible. well, if you say you have to be baptized to go to heaven, you're hateful because you use the Bible as a rule book and you're unloving towards other people. Well, if you say you've got to take the Lord's Supper every Sunday or that you can't use instruments, you're legalistic, you're pharisaical, you're unloving. They don't want love, they just want tolerance. Right? And we can see that plainly with homosexuality, but when you talk about things in the church, like the Lord's Supper or baptism or a cappella music, well, then it gets more fuzzy, right? We don't laugh as much. But it's the same thing. People don't want love. They don't want you to take them by the hand and say, well, let's look at the Bible on these things and see what the Bible says. Because I love you and I want you to see what the Bible says about these things. They don't want that. They want tolerance. They want to sit down and say, they want you to say, I don't care what you believe. You love God, that's all that matters. The Bible tells us that that's not the only requirement. That if we love God, that we're going to take the time to sit down and to read the Bible and to see what it says in those passages. Brother Rick.
And that's the sad thing, because you think about it, with homosexuals, if you love them, you would want them to turn that life around and to be baptized and to have a relationship with God. Just by tolerating them, you're just holding their hand and leading them right on to hell.
That's right.
You know, which one is more loving?
That's right.
The problem is, the left that's got that mindset doesn't know the truth of God's Word. And they don't want to know it.
Right. That's true. And that what you just said was the strongest argument that I had with that individual who was an agnostic. And I said, and he was a good friend of Ladd and I, and Ladd and I both were talking to him about this while at Freed. And we said, just look at it from my advantage point and just think of it this way. I said, if I believe the Bible is the Word of God, if I believe that, let's just say that's a given. And the Bible tells me that this is going to happen to homosexuals. And if I believe that, whether it's right or wrong, if I believe that, if I was then to not say anything at all, would that be loving or unloving? If I'm convinced the Bible is the Word of God. He said, well, if you're convinced, then it would be unloving. I said, so he didn't really necessarily agree with what I was doing, but he said, I can see it from that vantage point. And so it's not that we're trying to be Bible bashers or hit people over the head or be mean-spirited about it. I mean, just because you're right on an issue doesn't give you the license to be ugly or unchristian-like when you're trying to talk to other people about those things. I don't think any of us would advocate for that. But at the same time, we still have to take a stand for the truth. And because that's what the Bible calls us to. And so I would offer you the path is not love or legalism. It's obedience. Loving God and doing what He says because we love God. And those were those two roads intertwined. And so to love is to obey. Matthew 10:38 tells us that we've got to pick up our cross and follow Him. And it says, and if anyone does not pick up their cross and follow me, he is not worthy of me. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we going to submit to God's Word? Because many people use the love argument, I'm not saying everybody, but many people use the love argument so they can be God. They can be the final authority as to what is pleasing to God. We're going to do this at my church because I think God's going to like this. We're going to do this here at my church. Well, I don't have a church. Jesus has a church. I'm a member of that church. Right? Matthew 16:18, I'm going to build my church, Jesus talking, but I don't have the license or the right to say what the church is going to do or not to do, because it's not mine. But many people use the love argument as a means to say, we're going to do whatever I want. I'm going to live in the lifestyle that I choose. I'm going to love who I want to love, and God's just going to have to accept that. And you're going to have to accept that, because if you don't, then you're unloving. Well, that person doesn't love God or his fellow man. He just loves his lifestyle and is looking for a way to justify that lifestyle before others. And so we've got to be sure that we're not like that. We've got to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Christ. And so how can we make sure that we're loving God the appropriate way? 1 John 2:3-5 gives us the answer to that. Well, how can we make sure if love and legalism aren't two polar opposites, and if being faithful to God is an intertwining of these two different ideas, loving God but being legalistic when it comes to His Word and the application of His Word, how am I going to make sure that I'm doing the right thing? And so 1 John 2:3-5, the first part of 5 tells us how we're going to do that. And that says, and by this we know that we have come to know Him if we keep His commandments. Whoever says, I know Him, but does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps His word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. And so once again, we can see from the apostle of love, John, that this idea that legalism and love are two separate things pitted against each other is just not the case. But that true obedience to God is an intertwining of knowing the truth and then living that truth out. Questions or comments? Yes.
There was a show we're watching, and they was watching the film. There's a death penalty show. And I said, well, I think that's right, if they're doing it. They, kind of said, it's kind of wrong. You're not letting us love, you're not doing the right thing. You're killing somebody. I said, well, in the Bible, it says, you got my word.
Yeah.
Which what?
Yeah, well, yeah, like Romans 12:13 tells us, the government doesn't bear the sword in vain. And of course, the Bible tells us that extracting a vengeance yourself would be wrong. Like, vengeance is mine, I will repay, which is in Romans 12, I think, verse 13.
You kind of hate when you go, man, he needs a death penalty. I wish he would have it and get it.
Well, that's a good question. It is a good question. I think everybody should have the opportunity at forgiveness if you can. I mean, I always think about someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, who responded to the gospel in prison and then was killed shortly afterwards. Of course, if you don't know, Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer in the 80s and died probably, the mid-90s, late 90s? It was about that time frame. And so, was his conversion sincere? I don't know. Only God knows. But he was given the opportunity. But just because you have repented of your sins doesn't mean there aren't still consequences.
But I'm talking about the person that might be sitting on that jury. He's a Christian. He said, yeah, I believe he needs that death penalty. Is he in the wrong?
Well, normally on a jury, they just determine if he's guilty or not. And then it's the judge. Do what?
Death qualified jury.
Yeah.
They get a group of jurors that are willing to apply the death penalty.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. You could just be like my dad. He picked me up from school one day when I was 12 and said, come with me. I was like, okay. We pulled up at the courthouse. And there was like, is there any reason you can't be on jury today? He's like, I got my son with me. It's like, they're like, all right, you can go. Yeah, he didn't lie, but I'm not sure that was probably the best measure, but he did. He picked me up from school, was like, come with me. I had no idea what was going on. And he's like, any reason you can't be on jury? It's like, I got to take care of him. Surprised he wasn't like, why aren't you in school? But, oh well. Right.
It said 4 parents said they forgave.
Yeah.
So the judge gave 4 years in prison.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a sad situation that happened there in Chattanooga.
He had 600 notices about speeding.
Yeah.
That was kind of accidental. I'm talking about the one that's really purposely.
Right.
And then you got to make a decision whether you want to kill him or not as a Christian. You're on that jury, you can't get off.
Yeah. Personally, I wouldn't have a problem. We can have a class on that, but I'm pro-death penalty from Romans 12 and 13. But once again, I would not advocate for a Christian taking that upon himself. I think it's the government's role to do that.
He's going to die of old age in the prison anyway. It doesn't make any difference.
Right. I'd be more for more immediate. And but anyways, we digress.
Going back to the homosexual or any kind of relationship like that, if you do talk with someone and they still refuse to repent, what should your relationship be with them? I mean, you should still love them, I know.
Right.
But, I mean, is there a lot, should you, if they're family, say they're family, extended family or whatever.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Which is a great question. And what Ms. Lisa is asking with is, what do you do Where do you draw the line with someone if you lovingly show them that the Bible says their lifestyle is not according to God's Word and they refuse to change that lifestyle? What is supposed to be your appropriate measure of action? Are you to withdraw yourself from them? How withdrawn? What if they happen to be a member of your physical family? How does that work? I think it's a wonderful question, and maybe more than we can dig into in 8 minutes, but I think it's a great question. Maybe we could have a class on that, because I think it's important for us to know that, because I think in the church we've done a bad job with that. I think in some cases we've been too stringent, and in some cases we haven't been stringent enough. It would be a great class, because I think what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, chapters like 5 through chapters 8, is that we respond to those in the church differently than those outside the church. That those who have not been exposed to the gospel or obeyed the gospel get more of a leeway. We can have longer conversations with them, maybe put up with a little bit more because they don't know the truth. They haven't accepted the gospel. But Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5 and 6 that if somebody's a member of the church who's obeyed the gospel and they know better, and we lovingly tell them that they're in the wrong and they refuse, then we're supposed to ixnay, Pig Latin, which I think means like leave them alone or something. I don't know, or stop. But I think that's a great question. God has always had this path. The idea that love and legalism are intertwined into obedience is not something new. John 15:10 tells us, if you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. And so Jesus says the way that he loved the Father was by stringently obeying the commands that God had given him. And so Jesus tells us in John 15:10 that if we're going to stand up and say, I love God, then we better be able to stand up and say, I follow God's rules. Because if we can't do one, you can't do the other. You can't say, I love God, and then you don't follow the rules. And you can't follow the rules and say, I don't love God, because you've got to have both. To have one or the other is to be wrong. Ecclesiastes 12:13 says, this is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And to suppose that love for God comes without any obligations or requirements for the truth is just not right. 1 John 5:3, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commands, for his commands are not burdensome. And then, of course, in 1 Samuel 15:22, to obey is better than sacrifice. What do you mean? God's not going to be pleased with all the lights and guitars and rock bands and all the crazy stuff we do and all the money we send to Africa and all the kids we feed and clothe? 1 Samuel 15:22, to obey is better than sacrifice. To do what God says because you love him is better than to just do. We've got to make sure we have that proper foundation, just like it says in Matthew 7:21 through 27. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Both brothers made a sacrifice. Only one was accepted. That's a wonderful point. From the very beginning, right? And so, excellent point, Miss Lisa. And so, love and legalism work together and should not be pitted against each other as they are oftentimes. John 8:51 says, truly, truly, I tell you, whoever obeys my word will never see death. And so, that's the call of us today, is to not be for one avenue or path or the other, but to have the appropriate blending of the two, which, if you look at the Christian world today, if you look at the church, the Lord's church today, I'm afraid many people have forgotten the fact that you just can't pick up one and say, well, God will overlook the other one. As long as I go to a church that does what's right, I don't have to be emotion. I don't have to sing. And I'm not picking on anybody, okay? But if you go to a church, if you would not go to a church if they used instruments, so you go to the Lord's church that doesn't use instruments and you don't sing, that's like hypocritical. That's just wrong. And I get the fact that you might not have a great voice. And I get the fact that you may be subconscious about people hearing you sing. But, I don't care, neither does God. He just wants you to sing. And so to go to a church that doesn't use instruments, because that's what the Bible tells us to do, and then to stand in the pews and not sing, it's hypocritical. Because you're not doing what the Bible tells you to do. Because the same verses that tell you how to sing, tell you to sing. So that's what you've got to do. And so we've got to make sure that we're just not doing a checklist, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we're just not doing anything and everything, and then just chalking it up to, well, my heart's in the right place, God will forgive or understand. And so love plus legalism equals faithful obedience. They're not two separate paths, but it's something we've got to wrestle with, intertwine in our own life. Questions or comments or concerns? Your own ideas, Miss Susan?
I think Christians have been too passive. We haven't stood up enough.
Yeah.
Look at all the laws that we don't agree with already.
Right.
So
No, I agree. I think.
I guess we have to practice to stand up
Yeah.
for something.
I think you're right. I think sometimes we forget the verse that says that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-control. And sometimes we confuse meekness with timidness. And so we read verses like, blessed are the meek, and we interpret that as blessed are the timid, when the Bible tells us throughout the New Testament that God has not called us to be timid or fearful or to be passive, but to be active and to be courageous. And too many times we're too afraid to stand up for the truth. And we try to clothe that with being meek or gentle, but we're really just being fearful, which the Bible tells us that, as Christians we shouldn't be. And so we should feel more sturdy in standing for the truth. And a lot of times, myself included, we just stand by and say nothing, or stand by and do nothing. So, good comment. Caleb.
A lot of times when I hear this argument, when people say that you need to act with love towards everybody and everything like that, I think a lot of times it's love for themselves because, by saying that, they never have to offend their friend.
Yeah.
If you're going to public school, you never have to be the kid at school that doesn't like homosexuals that people distance themselves from. People try to be part of the mainstream Christianity of, hey, I'm a Christian. Oh, you're a Christian. Oh, yeah, I love everybody.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so do I. I'm a Christian too.
Yeah.
But when you say, hey, I'm a Christian, I don't believe in that. And I think that's wrong. I think what you're doing is wrong.
Yeah.
You're separating yourself. And I think it's where people want to be a Christian, but they also want to be accepted by everybody and be like everybody else and not, distance themselves. And I think the way the world's going is we have to do that more and more than we had in the past. I mean, back 50 years ago when somebody said, hey, I'm a Christian, I don't believe in homosexuality, everybody was like, yeah, homosexuality is wrong. But these days when you say, hey, I'm a Christian and I don't believe in homosexuality, whoa, what?
Yeah.
You don't love.
Yeah. You're not a Christian because you're unloving, and Christians have to love.
So I think a lot of times that argument comes out of the fact that people don't want to be different. People want to be like everybody else, so that's their way of explaining.
I think you made a very deep point because it reminds me of what Jesus said about the Pharisees, right? One of the qualms he had about the Pharisees, they had this outside image of holiness, but Jesus said they love the praise of men more than the praise of God. And so many times people are too afraid to take a stand and say, no, I'm sorry, I love you, but the Bible says this, because they want to be accepted by people more than they want to be accepted by God. And
persecution that was promised, we will face persecution.
yeah. If you're a Christian and everybody likes you, you may be doing it wrong, right? Rob?
What you said just a minute ago, I think often we are our own worst enemy in the church. That what you said a while ago about the singing, for example. I mean, a lot of times I think that's the side that we fall short of. They asked Jesus what was the greatest commandment, and I'm surprised he answered what he did. He said, love the Lord your God. With your heart, so is the greatest commandment. And I understand. I totally agree. You got to have both, but I think the love side we fall short on as often as we do. Maybe not take it up on the legal side. I mean, I lived in a congregation before in a church we went to growing up, supported the work in Haiti. And I've been in a church with, and not for as that, because I've been guilty of, with 40 or 50 people that was louder than we are on Sunday morning with 260.
Right.
But the life expectancy there is like 35 years old. So, it's kind of like we were talking about, I think, a week or two ago, too, the Lord, the parable of the more you've been given or the more you've been forgiven of, the more, loving and that you are. I mean, it shows up sometimes, and I think because maybe we've had to so do it. I mean, some of the songs we sing, when you read the words to it, I don't know how you can sing them. I used to go to church with a guy that every time he went to the Lord's table, it was just sincere. He would shed tears. Now, I'm not saying you have to shed tears when you went to the Lord's table.
Right.
But when you think about what took place it ought to move us to something close to that if we got the kind of love the Bible talks about.
Yeah. No, and I agree completely. And I think it goes back to exactly what you're saying. It's not one or the other. And we can be just as guilty of being too much on the, I'm just doing a checkbox, just as we can of, well, I'm going to do whatever I want. And there's the danger there. And like you were saying, if we come to church services here and leave and don't feel anything over here, you did something wrong. Like it wasn't the singer, it wasn't the preacher, it was you. And if we're not moved emotionally when we come to services, we got to take a step back, look at ourselves and say, okay, where was my heart? Where was my love and stuff like that? And so, no, I agree. I think we've got to be careful on both ends. So absolutely. Great point. Thank you so much for your comments tonight. We're out of time. And so let's go ahead and end with a prayer. Thank you so much. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your word and for the truth that we can find in that word. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to not forsake obeying your word for the idea of love or to be so stringent that we forget the fact that the reason we do those things is because we love you. Help us to have a clear mindset, to read your word, to study it, to love it, but to live it out in a way that shows other individuals that we love them even if or when we disagree with them. Please help us to be individuals that deny ourselves, deny the easy road, because we want to be sure that everything that we do pleases you, both inside this building and outside this building. Please watch over us and help us to be shining lights in this community and bring souls to you. In your son's name we pray. Amen.